been on very strong and sound engineering footing. But that as we move forward, more and more, we're introducing these externalities into the system that perhaps are not as well understood as the traditional combined cycle facility would be, or the traditional coal facility would be. In particular, at lunchtime, we spoke about the fact that there was a significant challenge, even with the environmental controls placed upon mercury emissions, NOx, SOx emissions, and so on, that as those requirements were placed on, it wasn't necessarily clear that we had the technology available to address them. The one point that was made, however, was that because we had certainty around what the legislative mandate was, we ended up also, therefore, having some degree of confidence that we could choose the best available technology, deploy it, and have a reasonable expectation of keeping investors whole throughout that process. We're not in that place right now, and that theme resonates throughout the session.
All right.
Despite the ice.
Yeah, I know. It's okay. Sorry, I laughed. Okay, so the final question, you want to pick either one. You know, what hasn't been answered yet for you, or what's been kind of surprising so far that's come out of the conversations to you?
Why don't we do the surprising one?
Okay. All right. So what have you been surprised by so far that you've heard?
I think you know, clearly when you gather a group of experts together, as Kima has done here, you are exposed to very different points of view and very different perspectives. And in some cases, those perspectives are surprising. However, we do have the luxury of having a broad perspective on the industry, and so perhaps surprised is not the right adjective. Perhaps the right adjective really is to say that it is interesting to see that there are very different drivers and motivators, for example, between decision-making in the Americas, and particularly North America, versus decision-making in Europe. So illustratively, here in the United States, most of the conversation, for example, amongst the senior executives today, has been around the fact that consumers are unwilling to spend more in order to achieve environmental balance, in order to achieve environmental quality, in order to get carbon capture, carbon reduction, and so on. If I listen to that similar conversation typically in Europe with European senior leaders, there's much more of a sense that this is a foregone conclusion, that it is no longer an open question whether they would be willing to pay more. They simply are. And so then the question becomes, of the technologies that can achieve the larger goal, which is the most cost effective? I don't necessarily believe that one is right versus the other. I think it's simply a different place from which we're beginning the conversation. In the United States, we've typically had much more freedom of choice around how we consume energy. And energy has, in many cases, become much more personal. We make choices around electricity consumption. We make choices around gasoline consumption. Those choices tend to be very personal choices that have historically not been either informed or, quite frankly, controlled by government. In Europe, my sense is that energy has, for a long time, been more communal. It's been more of a decision around how do my actions impact others. And in part, that's because Europe began many years ago, decades ago, in fact, with a notion that if we can limit the growth of energy dependence, that we would be in a better place. And so I think it's reasonable to look at the different dialogue and to understand that there are different starting points to that dialogue. Ultimately, though, I'm convinced that if we brought the CEOs that we have here in the United States together with CEOs from Europe, while they might not agree on the policy level issues around environmental and how much environmental cost we have to introduce into the system, I think that they would absolutely agree on the questions of reliability, universal service, availability of service to all, and so. So I think that while we tend to accentuate perhaps the differences, What's really interesting is where we find common ground.